Welcome to Villa of Hope Radio, brought to you by Villa of Hope, partnering with individuals, families, and communities to rebuild relationships, recover potential, renew hope for the future. Villa of Hope is all about your personal journey because you matter. Now, with caring hope and respect, we're proud to bring you Villa of Hope Radio.
Well, hello, and welcome to the Villa of Hope radio show on WYSL 1040, Villa of Hope, where you can rebuild relationships, recover potential, and renew hope. I'm your host today, Jerian Pushkas, Chief Advancement Officer at the Villa. Thank you so much for tuning into our show. We have some wonderful guests with us today to honor Black History Month with a discussion about redlining in Rochester and how it impacts our current state of poverty, education, and our local workforce. First up today, we are honored to have with us Simeon Banister, Vice President of Community Programs at the Rochester Area Community Foundation. 2 weeks ago, Simeon was a guest speaker on the Levine Center to End Hate's TEDx talk on the Tale of Two Cities, Redlining and Racist Policies in Rochester, New York. I was so impressed with his knowledge and his presentation that I just had to have him come here and share with our listeners. Simeon, I'm honored to have you with us today. Before we dig in, though, you have a very active position in our community. You do a lot of work here. Could you tell us a little bit about what your position is with the Community Foundation and what you do?
Sure. Well, number one, thank you so much for having me on today to share a few thoughts. I get gratified to work at Rochester Area Community Foundation as Vice President for Community Programs. And what that means for us is that I manage the grant making and community leadership work at the Community Foundation. Grant making is pretty straightforward, but community leadership is probably a term that deserves a little bit of unpacking. And that reference is leveraging the sphere of influence for the foundation, leveraging the resources in order to offer some insights, in order to offer really some leadership for the community. We know that the root of leadership in many ways is that we've got to be willing to do the homework. And so the Community Foundation, that's a really important dimension for us, is looking back historically, understanding the historical underpinnings in terms of how we got to where we are, and then thinking through how we can leverage that knowledge to start to affect the situation that we're in today. We work in two main areas, equity and vitality. For us, equity is subdefined. It's our work in partnering to reduce and deconcentrate poverty. We work to create racial and ethnic understanding and equity. And then we work to reduce the disparities in opportunity and achievement in education. And then we also support arts and culture, historic preservation, and aging. And these days we're also thinking a lot about the environment, and how we might be effective in mitigating some of the effects of climate change.
Wow, that sounds like a lot.
It is.
You said you're unpacking. There's a lot there. So, and interesting. We talked. You mentioned the history, and in our next segment, we're going to talk to Wynndy Turner, who talks about the effect today on the workforce. And I think what you're bringing, we're going to talk about the history.
That's right.
And hear a little bit more about that. I'm really excited to hear that. So, but before we step back in time, we're going to stay current here, because one thing that I've been asking a lot of guests lately about is that COVID-19 kind of has thrown a wrench in many plans of nonprofits and some businesses in the strategies. So can you tell us a little bit about the Rochester Area Community Foundation and kind of what you're doing now to help our community during COVID?
Yeah, so at the Community Foundation, obviously like so many, not only were we impacted, but we have the responsibility in some sense, the way our CEO Jennifer Leonard says it, is to help the helpers. And so we've certainly taken that mission very seriously. We've tried to be as responsive as possible, and that's included some things like, for managing grants and whatnot, we wanted to create a lot of flexibility for folks. There's some of the due diligence that we normally do that we wanted to just be conscious about, knowing that folks are under so much duress. So there was a little bit of that. But then also, we tried to mobilize quickly to make sure that folks were aware of the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program. I'm really gratified that many organizations in our community were able to take advantage of those resources to keep folks hired and on the job and continuing to serve in our community. We've worked with our partners across philanthropy, including the United Way, ESL, Farish, the Greater Rochester Health Foundation, and a whole melange of others that came together to create the Community Crisis Fund. And we were gratified to co-lead that work to distribute over $7 million in the community.
Wow.
And just a real testament to Rochester's charitable impulse and recognition that we have to make sure that we sustain our sector.
That's absolutely amazing. And I can say, the Villa of Hope, as a recipient of some of those funds, thank you so much. Just understanding and thinking about what our employees were going through and, trying to get PPE, trying to find PPE, trying to pay for PPE that wasn't in the budget. But I think the key for us was to take care of our employees. That's right. So our teams that were working overtime, or those that were working in the cottages that had somebody who had been diagnosed, staying in hotels so they didn't take COVID home to their families. And we were able to take care of them and to help them with that. That meant more to our staff than I think a lot of people outside some of our organizations will ever understand. In a time of crisis, a pandemic, for an organization's staff to say we felt safe and cared for is so rare. And we would not have been able to do that without the support that we did receive. So thank you so much for that. Such a difference that it made.
Well, John, too, we were gratified to do it. And you mentioned those families. And we also felt compelled to really step in and provide MiFi units and Chromebooks, and for Rochester City School District students through our COVID Education Fund. Also did some stuff in the region with that fund. This has been an all hands on deck effort, and there's so much more to do. I'll talk about this a little bit more as we move through our conversation, but one of the things we know is that as we start to see the glimmers of a light up at the end of the tunnel, we know that inclusive recovery is going to be an important part. And for folks that work at Villa and folks that are engaged here, we know that making sure that we have the broadest, most inclusive recovery is going to be an essential part of how we strengthen this community and set us up going forward. Yes.
And there is no better time than now. The community has become aware. We see things that are going on, and what better time than now? That's right. Right. There never is a better time than now for things, right?
Well, fair enough.
But especially right now for this, seeing what's happening in our community, and that people are in unique positions of not being surrounded by the same habits and conversations and water cooler conversations, right, every day. And so change is in the air.
That's right.
So let's do it, right?
Absolutely. We have to,
Yep.
I think that's one of the things that we've really been trying to impress upon folks, is that these conversations that we're having about equity, right, a lot of times they get framed and take folks down to the doldrums. We have to go back and some of the difficult history. And that's an important step for us to take. We have to do that. But it's also the recognition that we have this opportunity in front of us, right? That by creating more shared opportunity, prosperity, by creating more shared opportunity and more accessible opportunity, that we get to realize the fullest of our human potential. And that's how we grow our community. That's how we rebound from these economic challenges. And again, set ourselves up for the future. So when I talk about equity, I want people to get excited. I don't want folks to feel browbeaten. I want folks to feel like this is the chance. And now is the time.
It's the opportunity.
That's right.
We have so many ways that we can learn from each other and all grow together and to move our entire community forward. So I'm very much an all boats rise kind of person, and I absolutely see that, and I really hope as we talk about employers who still kind of like that it's the core of society right now, right? It's where you find groups of people can have such a big impact. So kind of looking back now on how did companies get the way they are today, and the policies and everything. So could you talk a little bit about the Tale of Two Cities webinar, which was just, fantastic, and people should see the recording if they can. There were some amazing facts highlighted in there that I think are so relevant to our discussion today. Could you share kind of high level with our listeners a little bit about that and the history of Rochester's growth?
Yeah, I do hope folks take the time to see the video, me along with my friend Shane Wiegand, talking about some of these issues. But in broad strokes, to give a little teaser, and hopefully this is enough to get folks excited about checking out the full version. Rochester, one of the things we often struggle with in this town is that I think we all know that we've got some rough statistics here, right? We know that we are in the upper ranks when it comes to cities that endure poverty in this country. We know that the income disparity in our community is significant. In fact, one of the most significant border differentials is between the border of the city of Rochester and Penfield, actually. One of the most challenging in the country, which was a fact that was raised during the seminar. And so people say to themselves, how did it happen? Like, how did it get this way, right? And a lot of times maybe we try to solve problems in an ahistorical way without recognizing that there were actual things that happened. Like, for example, this community, folks might know, started out, really kind of grew as a result of the Erie Canal and its establishment. And as the Erie Canal was established, late 1820s, by 1834, Rochester becomes an incorporated city, and we all know that there's a bicentennial plan that's currently underway. And as we become a city, we grow really fast. We are the flower city because we would supply the grain back to some of the big urban metropolises back east in New York City and Boston and other places. And so all of a sudden, this point of departure for folks heading out west to make their fortunes, many of the community's founding parents actually didn't stay. Their kids even didn't stay. They moved out west. And in the meantime, all of a sudden, Rochester starts to become a destination in and of itself. And as it grows really fast, there's a lot of innovation that happens in this community. And we could regale one another with all the different kinds of innovations that turned into the big companies that we know, particularly Xerox, Kodak, and Bausch & Lomb.
Our big three, right?
The big three. The big three. And that happened in a period that was like 1910 to 1950s, when you really start to see the establishment and significant growth of these companies. And along with it, there's concomitant growth, right? Growth at the same time of much of the capital creation that happens in the community. So buildings start going up. Rochester had a subway system. A lot of people don't know that. One of the first indoor malls in the country, Midtown Plaza, stood at the corner of Clinton and Main. All this growth happens in Rochester, and that growth happens at a time when many people of color simply aren't here. The population in 1950 of non-white people, of people of color in Rochester, was less than 2%.
Wow.
And what people should also know is that in Rochester at that time in 1950, there were 332,000 people in the city of Rochester. Today, there's about 200,000. So the city was as big as it's ever been, and it was as white as it's ever been.
Right.
And so
holy cow.
The other part of that story is that a lot of folks that did come to the community, people of color, vis-a-vis the Great Migration, which represents the single largest movement of humanity in this country's history, 6 million people going from primarily southern states, black folks coming to northern cities, creating all kinds of cultural production like the Harlem Renaissance and Chicago Blues, Motown in Detroit, right? All functions of this Great Migration. Here in Rochester, that doesn't happen until a little bit later. So the population starts to grow. 1960, that goes from 7,800 to 24,000 according to the 1960 census. And then in the 1970 census, the number of non-white folks in the city of Rochester goes up to 52,000 folks. But in the meantime, the overall population is dropping. And of course, listeners might be saying, how could the population of people of color be increasing, but the overall population be dropping? Where were the white people going? And I think if you're a student of history, you know, it was the suburbs, these brand new suburbs. And, there was a whole regime, Jillian, that was set up to get folks to buy in the suburbs. There were marketing ads and all kinds of things advertising these brand new suburbs, this new way of life, white picket fences and a dog, 2 kids and an apple pie, right? And that culture, unfortunately, was not made available to people of color. Right? Things like restrictive covenants, like redlining, and I encourage folks to definitely become knowledgeable about that, constrain people of color from being able to access these newly built suburbs, and constricted people to a life that was largely beset by poverty, because at the same time, folks couldn't access the job opportunities in our community.
Wow.
George Eastman, a man who supported many historically black colleges and universities, because life is complex, there's a lot of gray area, right? Also proclaimed that no black people would be welcome to work at Kodak. And when the guy that's at the pinnacle says it, it gives cover for other people to embrace the same behavior.
Right.
That's what happened, unfortunately.
Wow.
And so many people of color couldn't get access. Take that generation after generation, really 2 generations. My dad actually worked at Xerox. Ended up, in the 80s, going into the firm. Finally, things are starting to loosen up. Do you know, Jerry and I never thought about going to work at Xerox as a kid. Why? Because by the time I was reaching adulthood, the single generation of folks, my friends, their parents often worked at Kodak and Xerox.
Yeah.
The companies were on the decline.
Yes.
So we never got a chance to participate in the party.
Yeah.
Right? Never benefited from the economic growth and gains of those companies.
Right.
And that's for people that got those opportunities.
Right.
Many folks never even got those opportunities, have been generationally constrained to poverty in our community.
Wow. So
we put all that together. A lot of the circumstances that we see in our community, right, are examples of and the byproduct, the offshoot of this set of challenges. Things that sometimes get represented as, why aren't these people just get a job? Why are they so late? If they knew how to navigate the system. I mean, there's a lot of that language that gets thrown around. Bootstrapping, very paternalistic types of descriptions. What we know, unfortunately, is that in these scenarios, people are constrained by the environment that they find themselves in. And so that's a real challenge that we've got to really face in this community. If we're going to make headway, the environment has to change itself. Yes,
and it's going to take a lot of leadership to do that.
That's right.
Right. I mean, these are these acts that you've talked about. Some of our history is drastic.
That's right.
And I think there are so many people who live here in Rochester who have no idea. I grew up here in Rochester. I moved away and I came back, so I've lived a good portion of my life in Rochester, and I love it here. But when I started hearing about these things, it's very disappointing, and it makes me sad for such a wonderful city, and thinking about, the reputation that we had at the time. And, I remember, the house I live in, when I bought it, I was told, it's one of those Kodak houses.
Right.
It's a track out here in Greece, right? Or standing around the bus stop as kids in high school. So what do you think you want to do? I'm going to work for Kodak for the rest of my life.
Right.
You can't even think about that now.
That's
right? And so this is me with my Catholic high school kind of, so there's all the privilege here, conversations that we're having, and that wasn't even available. So, and that's just hard to believe for a seemingly progressive city like Rochester.
That's right.
So
when we say the tale of 2 cities, that's part of the reference, right?
Yeah.
That in some ways it's 2 cities because we know that there have been folks that have been able to access opportunity, those that have not, obviously, but also because this community has a duality. That we are indeed the home of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, but we're also the home of rampant income inequity, right? We're the home of rampant structural racism that we need to check and we need to deal with because it's undermining our future viability. And I'll say this too, because you mentioned being a Catholic,
a proper Catholic high school girl.
So coming out of that tradition, I'll tell you one of the things that's interesting. A lot of people don't know this, is that pre-1930 in this country, there were a lot of folks that were part of kind of white ethnic traditions, so Italians, Irish, and so on and so forth, that were largely disparaged in this country, that were not actually considered white.
Yes.
Right?
True.
That a lot of the homeowners loan corporation folks, please go and check the video out so you'll know what I'm talking about. But on those redlining applications and deeds that said need not apply, need not come here, don't, right? That they often referenced quote unquote lower born Europeans, right?
Yes.
What ends up happening in this country, it's a really important moment. I'm talking about the Know Nothing Party, which was in Massachusetts and had the governorships in 7 states, if you can believe this.
Oh my gosh.
And took over the entire legislature of Massachusetts, whose party platform was that Irish people were rapists, murderers, and coming to take our jobs. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, I've heard that story before.
Right.
Recently, right?
Right.
From leadership of this country.
There you go.
So, wow.
The Italian community. A lot of people don't know that Italians were disparaged, certainly, and in some cases, there was a really terrible incident in the late 19th century where a bunch of Italian folks in New Orleans were lynched. Just
gosh,
it was, folks ought to check it. There was an article in the New York Times last Indigenous Peoples Day that was entitled How the Italians Became White. Really provocative title, but really fascinating story. And so what happens is that people then get access to the jobs, they get access to the opportunities, and unfortunately, Jerry, that access is not universally offered. Right. And therein lies the difference. So my grandfather came to Rochester in 46, had been in the Army, worked construction, was a labor foreman for Pike, helped build many of the major buildings in this community. But my grandfather, unfortunately, despite his service, couldn't get access to the GI Bill, couldn't get access to loans, couldn't take out a second mortgage to build his business.
Oh my gosh.
And so while I am very gratified, I love my job, I really do. But it also would have been interesting to be the scion of the Banister construction dynasty. Right? Yeah. But unfortunately, those opportunities were denied. And again, the echoing effect of that, right? My granddad was was gainfully employed and was able to get my dad an education. But that's the exception in many cases to the rule. Right? And so much of what we see today is the byproduct of those historical circumstances. So we can't act like we're going to move forward without addressing that history. And that's a really essential part of understanding the presentation that we offer.
And we hear so much about the GI Bill and the great things that it did for people, but there were exclusions. And to think that, standing next to each other, a black man and a white man, and they're both putting their life on the line for this country and for our freedom. And one gets something and the other doesn't.
That's right.
They've done the same things. They have risked the biggest thing they possibly have. And one gets a thank you and the other does. That's right. Those are the things that really I find frustrating today, right? And so now I want to go look at our policies. I want to go look at things and I want to say, what do we have in here that is just subtly saying, oh, wait, we don't, we don't want to have that in there now because it is not who we need to be today. So,
well, that's it. And the thing is, again, what we're trying to encourage people, the reason to do this is certainly there's a moral argument to be made, and we often make it, right? But there's also just a very practical argument to be made. Our economy cannot function with the kinds of exclusion, particularly the racial exclusion, that we currently endure. And that's especially true in our nonprofit sector. And I can prove it in a lot of different ways. One way, for example, is that in our healthcare system, many of the healthcare organizations, like, our Rochester Regional and University of Rochester Medical Center, when they have an expense for Medicaid patients, say a dollar expense for a Medicaid patient, they get reimbursed about 38 cents on the dollar. Right?
Okay.
Now, you might say to yourself, geez, what does that have to do with racial equity? Well, we know the interplay between race and the likelihood that you will be on Medicaid.
Right.
And we know that if we have all these folks that are locked out of the workforce that aren't engaged because of hiring bias and all kinds of, because of this long legacy that people have kind of ignored, then we end up with lots of people that are on Medicaid, which is undermining the integrity of our healthcare system.
Right.
So one way is, do we just stop providing services to people? Well, that's ridiculous, and that only makes the situation worse. The other is, why don't we try equity? Last thing I'll say on this, the county's budget is 76% of the county's budget is on healthcare, social services, and policing vis-a-vis the sheriff's department, DA, and the jails. 76% trying to resolve the problems of inequity that we could have solved on the front end with making smarter investments. So next time you hear somebody say, I want my taxes lowered, say, try equity.
Yep.
That really is the answer.
Equity and prevention and investing today instead of in 10 years you're going to be paying $360,000 a year for incarceration versus programming or equity today and access to education today.
That's exactly it.
So it's, and I can share with you outside, I have done some analysis on this. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And just the money we could be saving on taxes.
Yeah.
And investing in infrastructure and education and health. So, Well, this has really given us a lot to think about. And I really appreciate you being here today. And we're going to talk to Wynndy a little bit about the role of Villa of Hope in some of this change in our community and how can we make that happen and change here inside the Villa. Because we don't want to just say that we're trying to be an ally. We want to do, and we want to have action. Right. And that's something that I, as an executive, will challenge others to say, if you're going to say it, do it. That's right. Just take some action, because whatever you do will be more than was done yesterday.
I'll give you one tip, one insight that I've had specifically about what organizations can start to think through. One of the things that we have in a lot of our organizations are credentialing regimes that don't necessarily match the outcomes, right? Give you an example of that. In public education, you now have to have a master's degree to be a teacher. We have a lot of people with master's degrees, but when I look at RCSD, I'm not so sure that the outcomes suggest to me that the master's degree correlates to being a great teacher, right? We know that there are other dimensions that we need to take into account. Some of the relational dimensions.
Yes.
Been in a lot of classrooms to see those paraprofessionals. Wow, they seem to play a really essential role, but they get paid a third to half of what the teachers are being paid. Why is that, right? We've got to wrestle with how we think about value and whether the credentials that we've put in place are artificial or not.
Yes.
And if they are artificial credentials, let's dispense with them and let's go back to the drawing board and figure out the things that are actually useful. And I think what we find is if we did that, we'd have a lot more people that have a lot of different backgrounds because they bring value, because diversity actually does matter, and equity actually does matter, and inclusion actually does matter, and it creates better outcomes. Yes. And that's the argument here, is that, again, this isn't to browbeat people. You look at this history, look how terrible you were. Terrible things happen, let's be clear. But there's this opportunity. There's a vested interest that we all have in getting this right. And that's what we want to leave you with is do this because you can be better. You can provide better services. You can engage the client population in a more sophisticated way. And you can do it in a way that gives you better results, not only for the organization, but for the people that you serve. Yes. And if you can do that, I think that all of us can make that contribution, make this community a lot stronger.
Well, we are on board with that, and we're going to do everything that we can. And I truly, truly thank you so much for being a part of this today and sharing with us. Listeners, when we come back, Wynndy Turner will talk to us about how redlining and its impact influences the workforce today. So thank you for listening to the Villa of Hope Radio Show on WYSL. Welcome back to the Villa of Hope Radio Show. Villa of Hope, where you can rebuild, recover, and renew hope for the future. We're here today with Wynndy Turner, our Chief Human Resources and Diversity Officer at Villa of Hope. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about the effects of redlining on our workforce, education, and jobs. Wynndy, thank you so much for joining us. You're fairly new at Villa of Hope, so we just wanted to touch base with you and help our listeners understand what your position is, why was it created, and what does it entail? What do you do?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jerry Ann, for the opportunity to meet your listening audience. Great question. So I began my journey, really my employment at the Villa in August of 2020. And as some people say, people are hiring during a pandemic, and I'd say, yes, they are. My title, as you alluded to, is Chief Human Resources and Diversity Officer. And I just wanted to share a couple of reasons as to why this position was created. First of all, kudos to the Villa, because the Villa had really laid the foundation for diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging work long before Wynndy Turner came to the Villa.
That's good to hear. Great.
So my job and my challenge, and I'm a builder. So my role is really to develop strategy around the foundation that was built, and how do we take this strategy and really implement and execute it through the organization. Wow. So I was hired here to do that part of the diversity, equity, inclusion work, but also as HR officer, what does that look like? So I want to share a couple of things that I do from an HR realm, but it really is to provide leadership and to establish the human resources strategies to align with the vision of the Villa, the mission of the Villa, the strategy. This includes, of course, employee relations, the normal stuff, and compensation and training and making sure that we're compliant holistically as an
Yes.
organization. So again, I'm glad to be at the Villa and to be on this next journey with the organization.
Well, we're so excited to have you here.
Thank you.
And I know from my personal experience that the Villa is a different place to work. It's not like every other place that I've worked. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious what your biggest aha moment or your biggest surprise you've had so far here at the Villa.
I have to tell you, my biggest aha is the intentionality at the beginning of all of our meetings at the Villa, because I had never experienced this before. And for those in the listening audience, we call it a community meeting. Mm-hmm. So before every meeting or every encounter that you're having with a new group or individuals that you're meeting with, there are 3 questions that are always asked, which I'm getting better at, because I'm used to, okay, hi, how are you? Let's get into the meeting.
Right.
But it really sets the foundation for how everyone in the meeting is doing. So the first question we always ask is, how are you feeling today?
Yes.
Which is important so we can get the temperature of the room.
Mm-hmm.
The second question is, what is your goal or objective for our time together? Mm-hmm. Which is really key because we want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as why we're here and what we individually want to get out of this meeting together. Again, being intentional. Mm-hmm. And then the third question is, whom will you ask for help or assistance? And that's key because you can say, Wynndy, I'm going to ask you, or Jerry, I'm going to ask you, or I'm going to ask everybody for assistance. So we're all a part of this. We're all buying into the reason that we're at the meeting. So that's been my biggest aha, because normally it's like, hey, how was your weekend? Let's get right into the work. So the intentionality is pretty amazing here.
And it really is, because how many times have we walked down a hallway and said, hi, how are you? And kept walking and not even heard what the other person said.
Absolutely.
But this is so focused. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, I'm going to ask you for help today.
Okay.
In doing this show with us. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, that's right. We always say, if someone says, I'm going to ask you, we always say, got your back.
Yes.
Got your back.
And I have seen that play out, and I have seen people follow up with others and say, I was a little concerned because you said you were anxious today.
Yes.
Or, and it's wonderful to have that support network. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. And a lot of people who come to the Villa really, really appreciate that. It really is a standout.
Absolutely.
So, and that's got to help with our retention, which is something that your department works with to a great deal, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you mentioned that we've been on this journey of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for a while. Can you tell us a little bit about what does that really mean to a workplace and to employees, and what types of activities employees engage in? Like what does this look like? Is it reading a lot of books, or is this talking, or what is it?
It's all that. It's all that. So when we talk about, another reason why I really love the Villa is we're not only talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which most people understand what that is, but that third word, belonging, is key. Mm-hmm. So you can have diversity and equity, but do people really feel they belong?
Right.
Because when you feel you belong to something, you're more apt to stay, the retention, you feel a part of this. So at the Villa, the first thing we did was develop strategy. So we had a foundation, we have a foundation, but how do we develop strategy around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging? And then from that strategy, what initiatives will we implement within the organization to drive the strategy? We have 4 different pillars to the strategy. So education is one. How do we educate our staff holistically? Organizational assessment. What does that look like in programs and departments? We also have to peel back the layers of policies, practices, and procedures. Yes. Because those are the real drivers for diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And then from that organizational assessment, what's needed in each program and department to move diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So some of the things that we've done thus far since November is we've established monthly learning circles. And these are voluntary for all staff. So we have a staff number about 359, 360. Great. So on a monthly basis, we have what we call learning circles for 1 hour, 3 opportunities a month. You can come to 1, you can come to 2, you can come to all 3, same subject. And we have an opportunity to talk as a village right? Going to breakout groups. So, for example, one month we talked about understanding privilege. We looked at a video. We read information and came together as an employee collective group, and then going to breakout groups. This month in February is structural and institutional racism.
Yes.
What does that mean? What does it look like? How do you feel? But the biggest piece is, how does that help me in my personal transformation as an individual for awareness and learning? But then how do I translate that to the work we do at the Villa?
Yes.
So how does that help me build cultural humility? You know, how does that help me understand the people that we serve, the clients that we serve? How does that help me be a better person? And how does that help me with people that I work with? So we have monthly learning circles. We have mandatory trainings for all staff have to go to. And we just did a quarterly training in January that was on implicit bias. We have affinity group meetings. We've done a book read with our leadership team entitled The Person You Mean to Be.
Yes.
We have external opportunities. Jerry Ann, you're involved in quite a few of those within the community. We're affiliated with our MAPI, the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative. RAISE, we did the 21-day racial equity challenge. We have executive coaching for our executive leadership team, and we're also working with Mary Pender Green, who is a consultant outside of New York City. So we take a holistic approach to this. There's a lot of initiatives, but also we're starting to put measurements and metrics behind that. How are we moving the needle? But one thing we know, this is not a linear journey.
Right.
It's not linear. It's cyclical. We're going to be evolving and learning and developing, and the development never ends. Yep. And we encourage everyone to be on that journey with us.
Wow, and you're right. It's not linear. It can be bumpy. It can be. You might step backwards a little bit. You might jump forwards. And I can say, having been in some of the activities here, one of the things that I love is it also gives us an opportunity to bond with our coworkers.
Absolutely.
On a completely different level than we normally would. And and the opportunities in the evening to talk to evening staff or other other shifts, other departments is fantastic. And I think that really helps us become a much stronger organization. And I think the other thing that is just fantastic is so many places I know this past summer issued statements on this organization and their Black Lives Matter statement. And one of the things that Chris Gullo, CEO, wanted to be sure of was that we weren't just saying something.
Absolutely.
You know, and as you go down this long list of activities that are going on, and not only internally, but externally, and it's not only talking about things, it's coaching, it's learning how to act, it's learning how to advocate, it's learning and learning history and all of these pieces. This is activity. This is people doing something.
Absolutely.
And you think about those 360 or so employees going out into the community. What an impact that can really have.
Absolutely.
So you've got to be so proud of this work. And
I am, and I have to say that my hat is off to Chris and the executive leadership team and our board of directors, quite frankly, because this is not, there's no silver bullet, as they say, to this work. It really starts at the top, and Chris and the team and the board have really conjoined on this, and the staff, to say, you know, this is not a one and done. This is a strategic initiative of the Villa. It is in the fabric of everything that we do. And when you have that kind of intentionality, the focus, the resources that the Villa puts behind this, you know, it sends a huge message not only to our staff, but to the community. And now, granted, you know, we're not there yet. We'll never be there. But then how do we take what we're developing inside the Villa and be able to serve the community and sit at those tables, which you do, Jerry Ann, to represent the Villa, and also do your own work, your own understanding, and I do the same.
Well, it's fantastic. And I know part of our learning that we've done is we've talked a little bit about redlining in Rochester. And I spent a majority of my childhood in Rochester, my adulthood in Rochester. And so I love Rochester, right? I'm one of those people. I love it here. And to understand that there's a history in Rochester that is not quite as sparkly and shiny as I see Rochester today. really takes a lot of understanding and to see how it's affected our community. And decades and generations later, after the redlining had been in effect and was accepted and encouraged, and no longer is, there still is an effect on the workforce in our community because that was so outreaching and so widely spread that today, generations later, we have this effect. So can you talk a little bit about, as a hiring manager and chief HR officer, what is your department, what challenges do you run into, and what does that look like? What's that effect?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and I really like how you segue what Simeon is shared regarding redlining and what effect does that have. So a couple of things come to mind is that as a community and as a villa, we need to peel back the layers to really look at areas that could be barriers to bringing people on board in organizations. So, what I encourage organizations to do, and I include the villa in that too, is to, revisit their policies, practices, and procedures, right? Mm-hmm. To evaluate if there are barriers to hiring a diverse and inclusive workforce. So that's the first thing. So people will say, well, okay, so, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. So the first thing we can do is start to review our job descriptions, right? When you look at it, a lot of times on job descriptions, I want people to start to look through the racial equity lens of, is something actually required versus being preferred?
Right.
That's a huge difference. And also in relation to education, job experience. We see job experience on job descriptions. Is it really commensurate with the job? Is it too much? Right. Is it too high? Or do we even need it to be there? And is it also exclusionary? Right? So we need to look at not only the language, but what we're asking for particular roles and responsibilities. Not that we don't want the best qualified person. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is look at our policies, practices, and procedures. You can start with the job descriptions. What other policies, practices, and procedures are done within organizations just because that's the way we've always done it?
Right.
Look at how are we promoting internally? Who are we promoting internally? Are we looking to promote internally versus going outside organizations? Right. What does that actually look like from an organization? So when you talk about redlining, that is part of this because that was a barrier, right? And where you could live and what you could buy. So we can look at hiring as another form of barriers. Right. What are we doing to remove the barriers of employment? And of course, always looking at wages and equitability of that.
Right. And it's so you mentioned, doing things the way we've always done it. And whether or not there's intentionality behind it, we have to go through the thought process.
Absolutely.
Every time we're hiring, we really need to look at those job descriptions and fine-tooth comb. Even recently I missed things looking through, and I know I'm still new to the journey. I've got a lot to learn. I don't think we'll ever be done learning. I truly believe that. But, there were things that I missed in there after I thought I did a great job. And so that's the humbling piece for us to say, you need to have eyes on it from a few different perspectives and make sure that you're really being, providing an equitable opportunity.
Absolutely. Here. And we really also have to move out of our comfort zone as far as where we post jobs. Who do we network with to go out of our comfort zone? Because so many times you might hear people say, oh, I can't find, this for this position. I can't find anyone. Well, who have you spoken with? Have you really searched your networks? It's the intentionality behind it.
Yep, exactly. And I like that. Who else have you spoken with? Are you posting it in one place that you've been posting for years?
Absolutely.
Or are we really trying to find networks
Absolutely.
to go to? So, in the hiring and employment process, there are some other pieces and you've mentioned already policies, procedures, the job descriptions, where we're posting. But I think one piece is, or maybe two pieces that we can kind of sum up some of these things in. There are assumptions made
Yes.
when reviewing resumes,
Yes.
and looking at different pieces of the employment process. And then there are those microaggressions that folks aren't aware of. So can you tell us a little bit about how does that happen, and then how does it play out?
Absolutely. So it's interesting that you asked that question, because this month, part of our learning circle is structural and institutional racism. And we also talk about systemic racism, and a component of that is just looking at resumes and how resumes can be segmented. So if someone has a unique, a common name, let's say Diane, but if someone has a ethnic sounding name that could be something else, let's say Dominique, or Steve and Jamal, right? Sometimes those ethnic sounding names, the resumes are separated, all right, because same skill set, same education. So we really need to be cognizant of not doing that, because unconsciously, sometimes we're making that separation right there. And you're missing out on a great opportunity to interview a great candidate. And other microaggressions. So, for example, someone may say, oh, this person of color was very articulate. Well, that's a huge microaggression.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful, intentional, and cognizant of the way we behave, the way we screen people for job interviews, what we say, what we don't say, and make sure that you're intentional and having someone cross-check you too.
Right.
Because sometimes we can be, consciously we'll say we wouldn't do one thing, but unconsciously we do something different.
Yes. And to be open if you do something and you're given feedback.
Absolutely.
And some constructive feedback on that, to be open.
Absolutely.
To listen. And I think some of the best things that we can do, speaking as a white, middle-aged, that hurts to say that, but a middle-aged white executive, is to be humble and learn, but you'll know that I'm doing my best when I actually do. When I actually listen to the feedback and I don't do something again, or I do something a different way.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's so important for people to understand that the feedback is to create a much more harmonious environment for all.
Absolutely. So. Feedback is a gift.
Yes.
Feedback is a gift.
So all of this information is absolutely fantastic. I'm loving it, and I hope our listeners are able to take away some of these ideas and maybe start conversations or implement them at their place of work. And we have talked about a lot, but is there anything else that you'd like to add, whether about redlining or about systemic racism? Any thoughts you'd like to add? We've got a little time. You can.
Well, what I'd like to do, and thank you, just in closing, it was very critical as we continue our work at the Villa and developing strategy to also develop a mission and vision statement for diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And when you talk about mission statements, it's really, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? And so as part of our sanctuary model, we took a holistic approach to this and to having staff really help us in forming our mission statement. And this went through probably 5 or 6 iterations through executive leadership team, our directors, our managers and supervisors, and our staff. So if you will indulge me, I would like to read what our mission statement is.
Yes.
And our vision statement for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Please.
So this mission statement is for the Villa of Hope. And again, this was formed by all staff, had an opportunity to give input. And as it reads, it says, we are committed to creating, nurturing, and sustaining a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. A workplace in which colleagues treat each other with respect by listening to different cultures, thoughts, and ideas. We are committed to an environment where we value and leverage experiences and possess the cultural humility to lead an engaged workforce, impact youth, families, and the community. So this is our purpose for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Of course, we have our overarching mission statement for the Villa of Hope, but we thought it was really important to put a stake in the ground as far as what is our purpose. What is our mission for this work?
Great.
And then we talked about our vision statement. And our vision statement is aspirational. It's where do we want to be as an organization on this journey. And our vision statement is we are a multicultural and anti-racist organization. We strive to build a greater understanding of community, systems, and the lives that we touch to achieve and advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so with that, I want to thank you, Jerry, and it's been a great opportunity to share the work of the Villa and to inspire others on their journey.
Thank you, and thank you so much for sharing that. I think, it's important to hear that there is a purpose and a vision, as well as there's strategy behind this.
Yes.
And so this is not a fad. This is not a come and go or the thing of the day that this organization is doing. There's a strategy. It's being built into the culture. And I think that's so important because what that says is it's here to stay.
Absolutely.
And it's not going anywhere. This is who we are, and we believe in this. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I really do hope that employers are beginning to make some of these long overdue changes, and that employers who are making these statements publicly are thinking the way that you, your team, and Villa of Hope are with having a very concrete strategy, activities, action, involvement. I really think that's so important. So
it really is. If I could just say one other thing, it does take courageous leadership to do this work. It takes courageous leadership. It takes time and really commitment at the highest seat of any organization to do this work. And it's not for the faint of heart, and it's forever ongoing. And so, it takes courageous leadership to really be in it. And your staff will know. Your staff will know if this is the flavor of the day or if this is really an initiative and the fabric of the organization. And the Villa put a stake in the ground to say, this is who we are as an organization. This is one of our strategic initiatives. And it is being built in every fabric of the organization.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, I want to thank you. I really want folks to consider the effects of historical redlining on communities of color today. I hope it opens our eyes on how people of color have been oppressed and how our hiring practices have continued that over time. But most of all, Wynndy, thank you for sharing yourself, your strategy, and being here today, and for being a part of the Villa of Hope radio show on WYSL. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry Ann.
Stick around. There's more to come here on the Villa of Hope radio show on WYSL.
For over 75 years, Villa of Hope has risen to meet the changing needs of our community. Caring staff at the Villa know trauma and how it can change your life. As we face personal challenges, the Villa stands as a place where individuals, youth, and families can rebuild relationships, recover potential, and renew hope for the future. For more information, visit villaofhope.org or call 1-833-993-HOPE.
The one media outlet you can count on. The voice of liberty. The WYSL stations.
Villa of Hope is here to help. Our Monroe County Department of Public Health is working diligently to reduce the chances of spreading the COVID-19 virus, and it's important we all follow those recommendations. That does not mean you cannot reach out for help. The Villa is here. We have people ready to take your call and get you the help you need. Whether you need general counseling, family support, MAT, or a compassionate ear, we are here. Call 1-833-993-HOPE.
You're listening to Villa of Hope Radio on the WYSL stations.
Thank you for joining us today on the Villa of Hope radio show on WYSL. Special thanks go out to Simeon Banister of Rochester Area Community Foundation and Wynndy Turner of Villa of Hope for coming on and sharing their perspectives, education, and experience with us, meaning very, very much for our community and for change that we see happening around us today. Stay tuned next month for the Villa of Hope radio show, and we hope to have some more interesting and relevant topics to share. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Villa of Hope Radio on the WYSL stations. Find out more at villaofhope.org.
Villa of Hope is in this with you. Fear of COVID-19 and uncertainty about the future creates a need for many people to get more support from their community. For many, things like not knowing how you can access childcare so you can go to work, wondering if you can go to work, and not being able to pick up the groceries you need because of empty shelves can cause anxiety and stress. This is serious. Talk to someone. Call 1-833-993-HOPE.